So our chapter of Orphans of the Tide today, I will read to you and you can read along on the Kindle, just like we do in the classroom. So it's chapter 11 called The Threat. And once you've listened to it and read it with me, there's a Padlet task for you to do and follow the link on Seesaw. The Threat. Anna didn't show up in the workshop at all for the next few days, so Ellie went about her duties alone, crisscrossing the city to fix drainage pumps and whalebone saws and fish gutting machines. But she was distracted and tired, and it was showing in her work. Twice she'd had to go back to mend a device she'd failed to fix properly the day before. The mood in the city didn't help calm her nerves. 3 days earlier, she'd seen a fight break out when a wealthy merchant was accused of sheltering the vessel in his wine cellar. The merchant and his accuser had wrestled each other to the ground in broad daylight until an inquisitor arrived and arrested both men. To make matters worse, Seth was constantly pestering her with questions. Sometimes they were overly personal. "What happened to your parents?" Ellie grumpily stripped the outer casing from a harpoon gun. "My mum died of a wasting sickness when I was 8. I never knew my father. He was some playwright. He died when I was 1. I'd rather not talk about it." Sometimes the questions were about Anna. "So is she your assistant or something?" Ellie carefully inserted a lens into a telescope. "Don't let her hear you say that if you want to live. She just helps me with my work now and then. She's my best friend." "Oh," said Seth, "then why is she not talking to you?" "I'd rather not talk about it." Other times they were about the city or the enemy or the Inquisition, but especially they were about Finn. "So where does he live?" "Oh, the other side of the city. Forget about him. He's really not that interesting." "But he went to all that effort to save my life, just to show off? What if he's been caught?" "He's very arrogant. Look, I'd rather not talk about it," Seth grumbled. "Yes, I know." Ellie tossed and turned that night. Her mind was a swirling mess, the same dark thoughts churning endlessly. With a huff, she threw off her clammy sheets and crept from her bedroom, trailing a blanket after her. The workshop was ghostly in the twilight, a sea of glinting metal and half-hidden shapes. Ellie tiptoed across the floorboards in her nightdress, towards the giant mound of books in the middle of the room. She stooped to pick one up. "A History of Executions," the title said. She winced and threw the book aside, then hunted around until she found one more to her liking. She stared at the cover. It was some sort of storybook. Ellie flicked through its pages. It was mostly text, but there were several illustrations. One showed the hero standing tall at the brow of a ship, a spear raised in his hands. She was certain the book had belonged to her brother. He'd been obsessed with the sea and everything in it. The walls of their bedroom in the orphanage had been covered with drawings of sea creatures, though she struggled now to remember what they looked like. Ellie searched the pages for anything her brother might have left, like a doodle in the margin, but found nothing. She sighed and closed the book carefully, then returned to her task, clearing a wide space on the floor. Next, she collected a stack of books, wedging them under her chin and carrying them over to the space she'd made. She built a wall of books that came up to her knees, as long as she was tall. Then she built another, parallel to the first, with enough room in between for her to sit in. She connected the 2 long book walls with a shorter one, making a rectangle with only 3 sides, then completed the shape by adding a pointed end to the rectangle from 2 more short walls of books, like an arrowhead. Finally, she added a pile of 3 large books inside, forming a seat, and then 3 more to form another. She nodded, pleased with her handiwork, then climbed in and sat down on one of the seats. She stared at the other. From the floor, Ellie picked up a broom handle. She held it across her lap in both hands, then began to drag one end back and forward in a rowing motion, never quite letting it touch the floorboards. She tried to imagine the sound of the sea lapping gently against the boat. She tried to imagine the cold of the wind on her face. She tried to imagine the presence of another person in the seat across from her. She tried to imagine his smile, the sound of his voice, his laughter. She tried and tried and tried. Then she put the broom handle back down and sighed. She hugged her legs, her pulse resounding through her whole body. She counted 30 beats, then sat up. The other seat was still empty. Words formed in her chest, spiny and sore. "Where are you?" she said. Her tiny voice filled the workshop. "What are you doing?" Ellie cried out and spun round, sending several books flying. Seth was sitting cross-legged on top of a giant turtle skeleton that hung from the ceiling, framed in moonlight. "What are you doing?" Ellie hissed. Seth looked at the strange arrangements of books around her. "Are you talking to your brother?" he said. "I wasn't," said Ellie adamantly. "There are tears on your cheek." "I wasn't talking to him. Shut up!" Ellie climbed out of the book boat and turned away. "What are you doing up there?" she said curtly. "You should be in the basement." "I like the way this sways," he said, leaning from side to side so the skeleton swung slightly on its chains. Suddenly hot and embarrassed, Ellie conspicuously picked up a screwdriver and leaned over the broken net cannon. Her nose still ached whenever she looked at it. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Seth stood up, balancing effortlessly on the turtle. He dropped, cat-like, to the bookcase below, then to the floor. "You were talking to your brother." "Seth, just shut up, all right?" said Ellie, violently prising open the side of the cannon. "I'm sorry, it's just... I don't have anyone to talk to, except you." "Now we can talk about other things." Ellie reached for a pair of pliers and pulled out a bent cog. "Here, help me fix this. Make yourself useful for once." He took the cog and held it still while Ellie strained to bend it back into shape with her pliers. "If I'm going to live here," he said, "you're going to have to talk to me." "Is that why Anna's angry with you? Because you don't tell her things?" Ellie picked up the net cannon. "What do you care about Anna? She hates you." Seth shrugs. "Doesn't mean I hate her," he said, following Ellie to another workbench where there was a large vise. "Every time I ask you about yourself, you start talking about something else." Ellie threw down the net cannon with a clatter. "Well, maybe you should take a hint and stop asking me. How would you like it if I asked you private things about yourself all the time?" "I'd love it," Seth said simply. "Only I don't know anything about myself." Ellie opened up the vise and wedged the bent cog inside. "It must be nice," she said bitterly, "not having any memories, not knowing about any of the bad things that happened to you, the bad things you did." "Hold these," she said. She held out her pliers, but Seth just stared at her. His eyes were wide in the moonlight. "Please don't say things like that," he said. A hot guilt bubbled up in Ellie's chest, followed by a rush of anger at Seth for making her feel that way. She turned from him, picked up a large hammer in both hands, and pounded the cog back into shape. She closed the panel on the cannon and risked a glance at Seth. He was looking at his feet. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was cruel." There was a long silence that made Ellie's palms itch with discomfort. "Here, why don't you be the first to test it?" she said, picking up the net cannon and offering it to him. He looked at it sceptically. "It won't backfire like last time, I promise. I fixed that little issue, and it's really fun when it's working. Go on, try." Seth took the cannon from her uncertainly, pointed it at the turtle skeleton, and pulled the trigger. There was a loud clunk, and a huge black net blasted from the end of the cannon, wrapping itself snugly round the skeleton like a blanket. Seth looked at her, his mouth a little open. "That was fun," he said. "Help me get the net down and we can do it again." Seth clambered quickly up the bookcase and snatched the net down. He looked around, eyes darting curiously. Then he vanished into the dark. "Seth, let's use this," he said, reappearing with a ball made from the skin of a pufferfish. "It'll be more fun with a moving target." Ellie grinned, feeling a tiny flutter of joy in her chest. They took it in turns, one of them throwing the ball into the air and the other one trying to catch it with a net cannon. They kept score, and Ellie didn't even mind when Seth got more points than her. After many rounds and a score of 21-12, she slumped down against a workbench, out of breath. She finally felt like sleeping. She realised then that she was sitting with her feet against the boat made of books. She shifted uncomfortably, looking at her lap. Seth sat down next to her. My mum used to say that my brother and I were her greatest inventions, Ellie said. She made a machine that could predict when a storm was coming 3 days before it happened. Can you believe that? But she thought me and my brother were better. Ellie found that her body was trembling, her chest tight. Seth watched her silently. I was supposed to keep him safe, she said. I was supposed to protect him. And when he got ill, I should have been able to fix him. She rested her head on her knees. When he got sick, I did everything I could. I went to the university. I scoured every library in the city for a way to save him. But I couldn't. I couldn't figure it out. My mum would have known what to do, but I didn't. And the worst bit was that he was alone. I left him alone in his bed. And when I came back to the orphanage, Ellie took a deep, trembling breath. When I came back, my brother was dead. She heard the sound of fabric on wood as Seth shuffled nearer. She felt the closeness of his hand as it hovered by her shoulder. Then his hand retreated. He needed me, Seth, she said. I couldn't fix him, and I wasn't there for him when he died. He needed me, and I failed him. You didn't. I did, she said fiercely, turning to look at him, daring him to say otherwise. Seth swallowed, and his gaze dropped from hers. They sat in silence. After a while, Ellie sighed, angrily wiping away her tears. She got to her feet and picked up the ball from among a pile of books. Come on, she said, tossing it into Seth's arms. I'm going to beat your score if it takes all night. How much longer they played, Ellie wasn't sure, though they quickly started giggling again. And as they got more and more tired, their arms became abysmal. Ellie laughed so hard her lungs started to hurt. She lay down against a bookcase. Giving up, are you? Said Seth. I'm done, she said breathlessly, and I could have beaten you easily. I was just being nice. Seth tutted, but kept smiling. Then he looked sharply across the room, like a cat noticing something no one else can see. What is it? Said Ellie. Seth walked over to the large metal tub and pulled the lid aside. Hey, what are you doing? Said Ellie, rising cautiously to her feet. The surface of the water was utterly still. Seth took a deep breath, and the water bubbled, ever so slightly. His eyes flicked to Ellie, and it stopped. He put out his hand, holding it above the water. At first, nothing happened. Then the water rose, silently, a smooth cone shape glistening in the moonlight. It touched the palm of Seth's hand, and his face broke into a disbelieving smile. He laughed, and the water spluttered playfully, spraying him before collapsing back into the tub. Ellie bounced up and down, clapping eagerly. You did it, she cried. Seth looked back at her with wide eyes. I did it. When Ellie awoke, her lungs still hurt from laughing. She was lying wrapped in her blanket on the workshop floor. She couldn't remember falling asleep, but it was still dark. She looked around and saw Seth sleeping a few feet away among a pile of books. He looked very peaceful. There was a tiny noise in the distance. Ellie tensed and sat up.